Welcome to the Legal Influence Podcast, a show for influencers and content creators looking to grow thriving and influential businesses legally. I'm your host, Kate Cooper. I'm an attorney, content creator, and owner of The Legal Influence. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk about some do's and don'ts when it comes to brand deals. But before I dive in, I do have to share some quick disclaimers. Nothing that I share today is legal advice. Everything is for informational and educational purposes only. While I am an attorney, I am not your attorney, and listening to this episode does not create an attorney-client relationship between you and I. So let's dive into some brand deal do's and don'ts. Remember that a brand deal is a business transaction, and so there are some legal and professional things to keep in mind, especially if you want to continue working with brands long term. So the first big do is to be professional throughout the brand deal. Again, this is a business transaction. Whether you're an influencer or a content creator, you're providing a service for the brand, and you want to make sure that you're maintaining a high standard of professionalism throughout the campaign. So what does that actually look like? It means communicating professionally with the brand, answering emails promptly, answering questions the brand has, and just being respectful and courteous in your communication. Chances are these are probably not things I need to tell you that you should be doing. But if you're going out of town, you're going to be unavailable, use an out of office response in your email to let people know when they can hear back from you. And ultimately, you just want to make sure that you're maintaining a good relationship with not only the brand that you're working with during that campaign, but with the point of contact that you're talking to specifically. Relationships are incredibly important in the content creator and influencer industry. People leave jobs, they move to new companies, and you want to make sure that you establish positive relationships with the people who are in charge of influencer marketing and making casting decisions for campaigns. You definitely don't want to burn any bridges that don't need to be burned. With that said, how do you deal with a brand that isn't professional? Because we've all seen it. Either a brand is just being rude or they're missing deadlines. So what should you do? Now, ideally, there are going to be enough red flags up front for you to really consider whether you actually want to work with the brand. If a brand is belittling you, putting you down, criticizing you in a way that isn't constructive, especially in the beginning when you're negotiating the terms of a partnership, those are red flags and really good information for you to have sooner than later. As you get later into a campaign, if a brand starts becoming unresponsive, it can be challenging to work with them. And again, that's really good feedback for you when it comes to deciding whether this is a brand that you want to work with in the future. So the next do during a brand deal is to always get a contract and don't be afraid to negotiate the terms. And I'm sure this isn't a surprise coming from me, but I really can't stress enough how important it is to have a written contract that fully outlines all of the details and important terms of your partnership anytime that you're working with a brand. This is going to help manage expectations throughout the campaign and ensure that you and the brand are totally on the same page with what your obligations are. A well-drafted contract should also protect you and the brand. It should protect your intellectual property rights. It should outline what to do in the event of disputes. And a contract you get from a brand may or may not do that. I've seen plenty of fairly drafted contracts, but I've also seen a lot of one-sided contracts that really require creators to negotiate in order to protect themselves. And if you want to know what you need to pay attention to when reviewing a brand deal contract, go back and listen to episode 6, which is called literally what to pay attention to when reviewing brand deal contracts. And if you need your own brand deal contract, I have an influencer agreement template and a content creator contract template available in the Legal Influence contract shop. These are both drafted by me from the perspective of protecting creators' interests. The influencer template is for creators working with brands on influencer campaigns where you're primarily responsible for posting on social media. The brand may or may not also get usage rights, which is an optional provision that is included. And then the content creator template is for creators who are creating content or UGC for brands to use. And then I also have a bundle available if you dabble a little bit in both. So I will make sure to link to the Legal Influence contract shop in the show notes so you can check those out. The last brand deal do is to make sure that you are always disclosing your partnerships properly. So when I talk about disclosures, I'm talking about FTC disclosures, so the Federal Trade Commission in the United States. I'm a US-based creator and attorney, so whenever I talk about disclosures, assume that I'm talking about the FTC unless I say otherwise. It is worth noting that most Western countries have their own fair advertising laws that are pretty similar. So if you're based in or have an audience who is based in places like Australia, Canada, the UK, the European Union, it's important to be aware of those laws as well. There's a lot of overlap when it comes to those requirements around disclosures, but there are some slight variations from country to country. For example, some countries may require your disclosure to be right at the beginning of a caption, whereas in the United States, you need to have your disclosure before somebody has to click read more. It needs to be clear and visible from the get-go, but it doesn't necessarily have to be the first word. I'm actually going to be doing a whole episode on FTC disclosures, including what proper disclosures look like, the circumstances where you need to make them, because it can get pretty nuanced. But I do want to highlight it here because it's really important that you are informing your audience anytime that you are sharing a brand that you have a connection with, whether that connection is a brand paying you for a sponsored post or from the brand sending you a product or hosting you at their Airbnb or restaurant for free. This is not only a legal obligation that you have, but it also just helps maintain an honest and transparent relationship with your audience. Not disclosing when you have a relationship with a brand is deliberately deceptive. And that's probably not the type of relationship you're trying to form with your audience. So anytime that you have a material connection to a brand and you make an endorsement of that brand, you have to disclose that connection to your audience. An easy way to think of it is like an equation: material connection plus endorsement equals disclosure. And this disclosure has to be clear and conspicuous. If it's hidden at the bottom of a caption, that's not conspicuous. So like I said, this is something that will be getting its own episode. And I will also link directly to the FTC's guidance in the show notes. Disclosing your partnerships properly also includes making sure that you're using the platform's paid partnership tool. This is something that you should look at as being a separate obligation from your FTC or other legal obligations. This is part of the agreement that you have with Meta or TikTok or YouTube when you use their platforms. Their terms of service require you to use their partnership labels, so you want to make sure that you're also doing that. I think there's a misconception out there that if you use the paid partnership label, then the platform is going to throttle your reach. In general, sponsored content tends not to perform as well as organic content. There are people out there who will deliberately not engage with sponsored content. But there are plenty of examples out there of creators who are disclosing partnerships properly, who are getting great engagement and reach. And I think a lot of times the way that sponsored content performs really hinges on how well it's integrated into a creator's organic content. I think the more creative control that creators have, the more their audience is going to be receptive and engage with that sponsored content. So, moving on to the brand deal don'ts. Number 1, do not miss deadlines. This is really going back to being professional, but I want to highlight it specifically because it's one of the issues that I see brands talking about a lot. And I've also worked on campaigns as a creator where the posting date just kept getting pushed back because other creators were late delivering their content. And every time that happened, that just meant the rest of us were getting paid later. So it's just not a good look to miss deadlines. So when it comes to working with a brand on a campaign, the brand may or may not already have a timeline built out. So for example, when they plan to cast influencers by, when they plan to send product by, when initial content drafts are due, when the brand has to provide their revisions, when final content is due, when the post goes live, etc. Generally speaking, I really like to see some sort of timeline in the brand deal contract. Doesn't have to be super specific with exact dates. It can be a window of time or a more general description, like within 2 weeks of receiving product, the influencer is going to provide an initial draft of content for review. You can also build in language that allows you and the brand to mutually modify the timeline if needed. but you want to have an idea of what that timeline looks like up front so that you know if you can actually fulfill the terms of this campaign. You might have a big trip planned coming up. You may have exclusivity agreements with other brands. You may have a lot of other sponsored content planned during the time the brand wants you to go live. So it's helpful for both parties to know what's expected up front to keep the flow of the campaign going and, again, know what the expectations are. Of course, emergencies can happen, and in that situation, you're going to want to communicate professionally with the brand, but you also don't want to develop a reputation for missing deadlines or being difficult to work with. Timelines are actually something that I talk about in my free brand deal contract checklist. So if you want to download the full checklist, I will have that linked for you as well in the show notes. It's a short guide and checklist with 8 contract terms to include in your brand deal contracts. So the last brand deal don't that I'm going to talk about is making sure you don't infringe on other brands' intellectual property in your content. So this includes any sort of copyrighted or trademarked material. Now, this is something that you will likely see in your contract, especially if it's a well-drafted contract from a brand. Essentially, you are guaranteeing that you have all of the rights necessary for the content you create. And there are legal reasons why that type of language is often included that extend beyond just the brand deal contract itself. It's included to protect the brand, but it's also there to protect you. It's something that you should be doing regardless. And so that's one reason why you typically see it included as a guarantee in a brand deal contract. So the primary place where this is going to show up is when it comes to selecting music for video content. You want to make sure that you are using music that is licensed for commercial use and royalty-free. Now, if you are creating content that is going to be on a specific platform, you can find and use commercial audio directly in the platform. TikTok has always made this really easy to do. You can now find commercial audio on Instagram too. So this is going to be your safest bet when it comes to finding music that you can use in sponsored content. You can also purchase a commercial license if you find music elsewhere, but you just want to make sure that the content is not infringing on anyone's copyright. You know, that Taylor Swift or Beyonce song might perform really well, but you don't want to open the door to what could potentially be a very serious lawsuit involving you and the brand. So making sure you're using music that is licensed for commercial use is going to help you avoid a lot of potential issues. Another place where you could run into issues with infringing on other brands' intellectual property is by showcasing other brands' logos or trademarked materials in the content. Now, this isn't quite as black and white as using copyrighted music. The answer to the question, is this trademark infringement, is going to depend on the circumstances, but your safest bet is always going to be making sure that no other brand's logos or slogans appear in your content. Again, you just don't want to potentially open that door to a dispute. So when you're shooting content, be mindful of what you're wearing and the logos that you're showing. Be mindful of what's in the background. And if you have to, you can remove things when editing. Last year, I did a UGC campaign featuring a pair of gloves that I was wearing while cross-country skiing. And there was no way that I could hold the ski poles and showcase the glove without also showing the ski pole brand. So that was something I had to edit out in photos, and it was super easy peasy. So those are some of my top do's and don'ts when it comes to working with brands. Remember, you are your own best advocate, and I want to see you succeed. Thanks so much for listening to the Legal Influence podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please make sure to give us a follow and leave a rating and review. And if you know any influencers or content creators who would benefit from this episode, please send it on to them. Talk to you soon.